During the 1960s, Sierra Leone, like the many other African countries recently emerged from colonial rule, struggled to find its own way and almost succeeded in electing a democratic government. In the 1967 Sierra Leonean general elections, which the opposition won, a military coup took place, and the army took over power. A disciplinarian named Andrew Juxton-Smith, with the rank of lieutenant colonel, was called back from his studies in Britain and installed as head of state. Those who remember Andrew Juxton-Smith's leadership claim that he is the only uncorrupt leader in Sierra Leone's independent history. He is remembered for accepted no bribes and no favours. His measures and attention to details, and also his propensity for lecturing people on what it means to work hard, didn't win him many friends. He tackled tribal divisions and cracked down hard on government corruption. His military government closed down state plantations that were inefficient, raised taxes and import duties, fired venal politicians, and put the economy in the hands of professional administrators, all of which brought significant unemployment, leading to a growing unpopularity in the country. To many, corruption seemed preferable to Juxon-Smith's long-term measures and strictness. Eventually, a coup, which was welcomed by the common people, removed him from power only 13 months into his rule, and landed him in jail together with almost all his officers. In this episode, we cover the life story of a forgotten West African leader who once ruled over the tiny West African nation of Sierra Leone in the 1960s. Andrew Terence Juxton-Smith was born on November 30, 1931 in Freetown, of what was then known as British Sierra Leone, as the son of Alfred Juxon-Smith and Patience Cole. Juxon-Smith was born into a Christian family, and he was the second of 9 children. As a Christian boy growing up, he was educated at the Methodist Boys High School, a Christian missionary school in Freetown that was founded in 1874. Soon after he left school, he joined the Sierra Leone Army in 1951 and was commissioned in 1953 after graduating from Britain's Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst in England. By 1958, Juxon-Smith had attained the rank of captain. On April 27, 1961, Sierra Leone gained its independence from Britain and became a member of the Commonwealth of Nations, with Sir Milton Margai of the Sierra Leone People's Party (SLPP) as its first prime minister, and upon his death in 1964, he was succeeded by his younger brother Sir Albert Margai as the country's second prime minister. By 1965, Juxon-Smith had attained the rank of major. In 1966, he went on study leave to pursue a senior officer's course at a British military staff school in England. While in Britain in 1966, he was promoted to lieutenant colonel. Deeply religious, Juxon-Smith was a non-smoker and a non-drinker. Apart from the army and the affairs of his country, his interests included economics. His hobbies included reading philosophical works, especially the works of Plato. He also played tennis. He frequently wore the fur hat that is the symbolic headgear of African nationalists. While he was in Britain, Sierra Leone held its second general election as an independent nation in March 1967, with the first being held in 1962. However, close to the elections, the deputy force commander of the Sierra Leone Army, Colonel John Amadou Bangura, was implicated in a coup plot. In February 1967, Prime Minister Sir Albert Margai announced on national radio that an army plot to overthrow the government had been discovered. Subsequently, the deputy force commander, Colonel John Amadou Bangura, was arrested and detained together with 7 junior officers, mostly from the northern part of the country. In early March 1967, preliminary investigations began with a view to determine whether the accused men should stand trial before a military tribunal or not. The investigations conducted under Albert Margai continued for a few weeks. The matter of the coup suspects was, however, overshadowed by the preparations for the general elections. The 1967 Sierra Leonean general election was the first successful democratic election held in post-colonial Africa. Opposition leader Siaka Stevens of the All People's Congress (APC) party won the election, but was deposed in a military coup after only few hours of his swearing in as prime minister on March 21, 1967. The army commander, Brigadier General David Lansana, took power and detained Siaka Stevens and the Governor-General and declared martial law. 2 days later, on March 23, 1967, Brigadier General David Lansana was himself overthrown in a counter-military coup by a group of majors, namely Major Augustine Charles Blake, Major Sandy Bokari Jumu, and Major Bokari Idrissa Kai Samba. Sir Albert Margai, and Brigadier General David Lansana were both arrested and detained. The political loyalties of all three officers lay with the SLPP camp, but not with Albert Margai. Major Kaisamba's brother, Kutubu Kaisamba, was not only a thorn in Albert Margai's political flesh. His defection from the SLPP actually cost Albert Margai the 1967 elections. The two coups of 1967 were nonetheless similar in that they represented the continuation of civilian party politics by other means. The trio who removed Brigadier General David Lansana from office was certainly not Albert Margai loyalists, but they were even less sympathetic to the prospect of an All-People's Congress (APC) government, the party that won the 1967 elections. Thus, rather than return the country to constitutional rule, the trio of coup leaders decided to form a military government. On the evening of March 23, 1967, Major Blake went to the radio announcing the formation of a National Reformation Council (NRC) as an interim measure. Major Blake promised that the new regime would not take cognizance of the past and would not mount exhaustive inquiries into the liberty and possessions of individuals. He also stated that a National Advisory Council consisting of prominent civilians would be set up. He suspended the constitution and imposed a ban on all political activity. Major Blake also reassured the international community, declaring that Sierra Leone would remain within the Commonwealth and continue to recognize the British monarch as head of the Commonwealth and head of state. This sufficiently reassured the British government, which announced in the House of Commons in the Parliament of the United Kingdom on April 2nd that as there had been no change in the Queen's status as head of state, no formal act of recognition of the new regime by Her Majesty's government was required. The Governor-General continued to be held under house arrest, and Albert Margai and Siaka Stevens were taken into protective custody. Major Blake promised that these people, along with the detained military officers, would be released in due course. Initially, the NRC announced that its leader would be Lieutenant Colonel Ambrose Patrick Genda, who at the time was the country's second secretary at the United Nations in New York. Lieutenant Colonel Ambrose Patrick Genda was posted abroad in 1966 after the force commander, Brigadier General David Lansana, accused him of acts of insubordination. He was cashiered from the army and given an administrative post in the Ministry of External Affairs, and later sent on a diplomatic assignment in the Sierra Leone mission to the United Nations. 4 days after the announcement, there was a sudden change in leadership. Lieutenant Colonel Ambrose Patrick Genda was replaced as leader of the NRC by Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Juxton-Smith, who at the time of his appointment was on an officer's course in Britain. The NRC was composed of 5 senior army officers: Lieutenant Colonel Juxon-Smith, Major Blake, Major Jumu, Major Kaisamba, and Major Abdul Touré, who was in Britain studying at Cambridge, was recalled, and 2 senior police officers, the Commissioner of Police William Lee and the Deputy Commissioner of Police Alpha Kamara. Explaining officially at a news conference on 28 March, William Lee stated that they had thought it prudent to maintain a regional balance, hence the replacement of Lieutenant Colonel Ambrose Patrick Genda by Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Juxton-Smith, and the decision to have 2 NRC members for each of the 3 provinces and the western area. Lieutenant Colonel Ambrose Patrick Genda's removal as chairman may have been owing to the fact that he had been dismissed from the army for insubordination in 1966, weighed heavily against his becoming head of state of a military government, in spite of his known opposition to Brigadier General David Lansana and Albert Margai. Rumor also had it that he was in a mood to hand over power immediately to the APC, a prospect that did not appeal readily to the 3 majors who had played the most significant role in overthrowing Brigadier General David Lansana. On March 28, Juxon-Smith returned from his officer's course in Britain and assumed chairmanship of the NRC Secretariat, which took over the Prime Minister's office and reduced the 14 existing ministries to 9 departments. As leader of the NRC, Juxon-Smith automatically became head of state at age 35. He also took charge of the departments of finance and the interior. The NRC appointed the Commissioner of Police William Lee as its deputy chairman. As deputy chairman of the NRC, William Lee was also responsible for foreign affairs. Major Blake was in charge of trade, industry and agriculture. Major Kaisamba was in charge of works, transport and communications. Major Jumu was in charge of health, and Major Abdul Turai was in charge of education. The Assistant Commissioner of Police Alpha Kamara became the NRC representative with special responsibility for social services. Captain Foya, an army captain, became the NRC member with special responsibility in the council's secretariat. a position that was refilled every 3 months by a captain. In his early speeches, Juxon-Smith stressed the fact that there had been massive corruption during civilian rule, and politicians had emphasized tribalism to further their personal ambition, thereby ruining the nation. He pledged to eradicate tribalism, bribery, corruption, and nepotism. He stated that the word tribe had died a perpetual death as far as the NRC was concerned, and that every Sierra Leonean had equal rights in the country, regardless of their tribe. In an interview on March 31st, Juxon-Smith placed the blame for the country's difficulties on the politicians.
But the people will accept this military government?
I have not the slightest doubt. One of our officers, Major Jumo, went to the provinces, and his reports and observations were that the people were relieved, in fact, that the army had stepped in, because they themselves were so fed up with the political rivalries. I grew up in this country, and during my boyhood days, I never knew whether one tribe was different from another. There was certainly not inter-tribal rivalries and bitterness. It was only since politics came that I became a Mendian, you became a Timian. We wouldn't sit down together, and surely what we're trying to do now, not only rectifying the finance, we're also going to rectify the moral aspect of the state, which is a necessary element of it, so that Mr. X, whether he comes from the northernmost part of the country, should be able to sit down with Mr. Y, who comes from the south, and discuss things. They wouldn't necessarily see eye to eye. No two persons think alike, but they should be able to arrive at a compromise. And when they do strike a compromise, they should both be able to honor their compromise.
But you are blaming fairly and squarely the politicians for this?
Most definitely. They've handled the situation so recklessly. So poorly. They were all fighting for power. Those who had it did not want to give up. We would have failed in our duty, by that the army and the police, to our country and to posterity and to the world, if we would let the blood of our brothers and sisters run the streets of Freetown just to fill up somebody's pocket.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
As a disciplinarian, he observed that some civil servants reported for work rather late in the morning, and he vowed to put an end to this practice. According to one of his earlier pronouncements on the subject, he said a civil servant must be prepared to work for 24 hours for the state. In order to ensure that all civil servants reported for work early, he started showing up unexpectedly early at various ministerial offices in Freetown. A no-nonsense man, he also ensured that all ministers were engaged in field activities rather than sitting in the office. For example, the Minister of Education was on the road visiting schools, sitting in class for the entire day. The Minister of Agriculture was in the provinces, the Minister of Health in hospitals. Juxon-Smith too was also constant on the road. Juxon-Smith was clearly in a fighting mood. Decrees banning newspapers, public meetings except for sports and recreation, the Mammy Queens, women appointed during Sir Albert's days to spread SLPP influence, and tribal headmen in Freetown were promulgated in quick succession within the next few months. These were followed by changes in nomenclature. Thus, ministries became departments, permanent secretaries were to be known simply as secretaries of their various departments, whilst district officers and provincial secretaries became district commissioners and provincial commissioners respectively. The Freetown City Council and district councils in the provinces were taken over by committees of management appointed by the NRC. In characteristic military style, Juxon-Smith warned people planning trouble against his regime that they would face military court-martial with a maximum sentence of death by firing squad. He also warned anybody who violated the new regulations was to be severely dealt with. He professed to follow both Muslim and Christian religions, attending both church and mosque at times. Many of his public pronouncements referred to the help of Almighty God. Although Juxon-Smith appeared to be a priest, preaching a return to morality in public affairs, he could not transform the Sierra Leonean society overnight. Many prominent civil servants who had been closely linked with the Albert Margai regime retained their posts. Peter Tucker, the NRC Secretary General, and S.B. Daramy, the Financial Secretary, were very important figures in the discredited SLPP. In addition, the army could not boast of enough qualified personnel to man the various key posts in the nation. In consequence, it soon dawned on Juxon-Smith and his NRC colleagues that he should woo prominent civilians in the task of national reconstruction. The army's great need for civilians in the running of the nation's affairs was evident in the appointment of a National Advisory Council, which first met in April 1967. Among other things, the council was to discover ways and means of bringing about national unity, free of tribalism and separatist agitation, to ensure a peaceful return to civilian rule after a general election. It was also empowered to hammer out a constitution that would obviate all the major causes that had created conflict and fostered corruption. Juxon-Smith calculated that this process would take at least 15 months. To prove that the previous government had been buried in the morass of corruption which he was determined to stamp out, Juxon-Smith soon appointed a series of commissions of inquiry to investigate, among other things, the assets of ex-ministers and some prominent civil servants of the former regime. The operations of the Sierra Leone Produce Marketing Board, believed to be a hotbed of corruption, were also investigated. The establishment of these commissions reflected Juxon-Smith's desire to root out corruption and to build a healthy nation. In addition, it was believed that these commissions would prove that the country's financial problems could be blamed on large-scale infiltration by politicians and their henchmen. Nevertheless, the institution of these commissions of inquiry was in stark contrast to Major Blake's promise that the army did not propose to take cognizance of the past, to mount exhaustive inquiries into the liberty and possessions of individuals. A commission of inquiry known as the Forster Commission of Inquiry was established, which sat from May 1967 to February 1968 to examine the assets of ex-ministers and senior civil servants earning about 3,200 Leone per year. The blistering report of the commission showed how the SLPP politicians, with Sir Albert Margai at the helm, had defrauded the nation of several million Leones. Various sums were ordered to be paid back to the treasury. The NRC Secretary General, Peter Tucker, who was among the civil servants arraigned before the commission, was soon replaced in January 1968. The commissions of inquiry were popular affairs, especially in Freetown, where the APC had won a landslide victory in the March election. The general election, which had brought about the establishment of military rule, was investigated by another commission of inquiry, known as the Dove-Edwin Commission, which began sitting in 1967. It was to inquire into the conduct of both parties in the election, the actual result of the election, and the custody of ballot papers. When the commission submitted its report in September 1967, it entirely confirmed the APC's verdict that the SLPP's election strategy was corrupt. Strong evidence was brought forward showing the tampering with ballot papers, illegal possession of the papers by SLPP sympathizers, and violence in many areas. The commission, by openly declaring that the APC had won the election on their own merit, was, in effect, challenging the continued exercise of military rule. The NRC, in a white paper accompanying the report, agreed with the commission's findings, except the one which says that civilian rule must be restored under Siaka Stevens and the APC. Nevertheless, realizing that most people wanted an end to military rule, the white paper carried a promise by the junta to establish a civilian rule committee. It took almost 2 months for the NRC to publicize the findings of the Dove-Edwin probe. By their delaying tactics, the military men turned many moderate citizens into radical opponents of the regime. Another commission of inquiry, known as the Bioku Betts Commission of Inquiry, found the future president, Ahmed Tejan Kaba, culpable of financial irregularities at the Sierra Leone Produce Marketing Board, SLPMB, when he served as permanent secretary in the Ministry of Trade and Industry. He was banned from ever holding public office. However, Ahmed Tejan Kaba was granted indemnity in 1988 by President Joseph Saidu Momo. The NRC's open rejection of some of the inquiry's conclusions meant that it considered itself the sole legitimate government of the country. People came to feel that the NRC was not just engaged in a holding action, but sought to entrench itself on the political scene. It was inevitable that opposition to Juxon-Smith and the NRC would surface early on during the regime's first days in power. Military intervention was not a welcome event, since the former army commander Brigadier General David Lansana had been shown to be the willing tool of the SLPP leader. By failing to hand over power to Siaka Stevens, the NRC was accused by APC supporters of willfully denying them their hard-won prize. Many of them took flight in the early days of military rule. Their leader, Siaka Stevens, was released from detention and allowed in September 1967 to proceed to Britain for medical treatment. Other groups within the country came out in opposition to the regime. The intellectuals at the Fora Bay College and Jala University College launched attacks against the NRC in various memoranda. The documents abhorred the practice of detaining people without trial, denounced the abrogation of individual rights, and demanded a speedy return to civilian rule, accompanied by the transfer of power to the constitutionally appointed Prime Minister, meaning Siaka Stevens. During the March elections, many students and staff had canvassed votes for the APC. Equally vigorous opposition to NRC rule was expressed by the Sierra Leone Bar Association. At a meeting with Juxon-Smith, the group called for an early return to constitutional rule. Pro-APC women also came out in defiance of the regime. When the National Advisory Council held its first meeting in April 1967, they demonstrated along the route to the Parliament building, many of them lying across the road. Faced with such a barrage of opposition, Juxon-Smith and his regime responded speedily. Some members of the Bar Association were threatened with detention, and a Sri Lankan lawyer was deported. Following the women's demonstrations, the NRC announced that any defiance of the ban on public gatherings would be treated severely. Juxon-Smith made it clear that the council did not wish to hand over power to Siaka Stevens as Prime Minister as a result of the last election. Some of the reasons for the opposition to the NRC could be found in the character of Juxon-Smith himself. He was described as a rather vainglorious individual who must have loved the exercise of power, to have wished to become the first president of Sierra Leone. In fact, he touted for the executive type of presidency, as he made plain to the Advisory Council. Juxon-Smith showed insufficient courtesy to many people who, in age and education, were superior to him. He showed scant respect for top civil servants, whom he threatened to dismiss over the slightest misstep. This arrogant attitude of the 35-year-old Juxon-Smith provoked the ire of council members, with whom he disagreed on many issues. William Lee, the deputy chairman of the NRC, is reported to have advised Juxon-Smith to pipe down, especially in the first few months of their rule, when Juxon-Smith had his hand in every pie. Juxon-Smith reportedly hurled imprecations at his colleagues on the council and at one stage told them that, "You will all die as sinners." Thus, even within the ranks of the NRC, Juxon-Smith was not prepared to accept a dissenting opinion. There were differences with Major Blake over control of the 1 Battalion Army. Juxon-Smith presumably wanted to be head of state and exercise the functions of force commander at the same time. Besides the Juxon-Smith and Major Blake disagreement over the overall control of the army, the NRC quarreled over many issues, chief of which was the fate of the officers detained for alleged complicity in a plot to overthrow Albert Margai in February 1967. Juxon-Smith wanted them reinstated into the army, with the exception of Colonel John Amadou Bangura, who, possibly to remove any influence he might have as a potential rival, was to be retired and given a diplomatic assignment abroad. Some NRC members, notably Major Jumu and Major Kai Samba, felt that the officers should be tried, for had that coup succeeded, they themselves would have been prime targets. However, Colonel John Amadou Bangura was released from prison and was posted to a diplomatic position with the Sierra Leone Embassy in the United States. Differences also arose over the conduct of the commissions of inquiry, which ran counter to Major Blake's promise not to institute inquiries during the announcement of the coup, as the commissions of inquiries targeted members of the previous SLPP government, some of whom were relatives of some NRC members. The differences became so polarized that on several occasions Juxon-Smith and Major Blake threatened to arrest each other. As the dissension continued, Major Jumu planned to arrest both men, but was dissuaded by the deputy chairman William Lee. In the wake of these quarrels, Major Abdul Toure, the NRC member in charge of education, resigned and went back to Cambridge to resume his studies. He was replaced by another northerner, Major Mark Koroma. It is pertinent at this juncture to consider the economic measures undertaken by the regime, since Major Blake had added the deplorable economic situation to the list of reasons for the NRC's assumption of power. The NRC inherited an economy that was far from healthy. Back in early 1967, with a general election in view, the SLPP government, in spite of warnings from the International Monetary Fund, IMF, found it difficult to reduce expenditure on the civil service and official travel outside Sierra Leone. It plunged into large money-consuming projects, such as the establishment of coffee, cocoa, and ginger plantations, which were soon alleged to be unviable. As a result of these costly ventures, the Sierra Leone Produce Marketing Board, SLPMB, was unable to pay farmers in cash and gave them credit chits instead. Faced with such a dim prospect, farmers began to smuggle the produce out of the country, a situation that benefited Sierra Leone's neighbors. In attempting to revamp the SLPMB, the NRC closed down many of the plantation and laid off the board's group of directors who had been appointed by politicians. In other areas, the NRC dismissed many workers, froze many vacancies, and, following IMF guidelines, devalued the Leone in line with a similar move by the British government. Strenuous efforts to reduce the government's deficit produced surtaxes on personal income tax and company tax, higher import duties, and significant levies on diamond dealers. The result of the exercise was a favorable economic climate, with an increase in external resources from 12 million leones at the end of 1966 to 16 million leones by the time the NRC was ousted from office in April 1968. A corresponding reduction in the government deficit was also evident. By these measures, the regime was able to resuscitate the SLPMB, provide farmers with payment in cash, check the smuggling of produce, and settle some short-term debts owed to foreign commercial concerns. The instrument behind this appreciable recovery was the Economic Advisory Council, which Juxon-Smith set up in May 1967. These improvements in the country's economic position were, however, realized at a very severe cost. The mass dismissals and forced retirements in certain sectors were a source of agony for many homes in a country where the government is the largest employer. Austerity measures were forced on the nation at a time when wages could not keep pace with the soaring prices of basic commodities. But unlike a civilian regime, the military government could not fathom the extent of public discontent since it felt itself accountable to no one. In its foreign policy, the NRC, according to Major Blake's announcement at the takeover, promised to continue to recognize the Queen in London as the head of the Commonwealth and to honor all international obligations entered into by the previous government. The NRC government sent delegates to an OAU Ministerial Council meeting at Kinshasa in early September and attended the 22nd session of the United Nations General Assembly. Meanwhile, Siaka Stevens, who was released from prison in September 1967, later established himself in neighboring Guinea to train his political thugs and mercenaries in neighboring Guinea in order to overthrow Juxon-Smith and the NRC, as he, Siaka Stevens, believed he was the winner of the 1967 election and that he had been robbed of victory by the 1967 coup led by Brigadier General David Lansana. So he established himself in Guinea, where the Guinean leader, Sékou Touré, supplied both training facilities and weapons to several hundred APC exiles. Whilst Colonel John Ahmad Bangura was in the United States, Siaka Stevens negotiated with him to leave his post and join him in Guinea in order to help him train his political thugs and mercenaries in neighboring Guinea to cross over to Sierra Leone and overthrow Juxon-Smith and his NRC military regime. Colonel John Amadou Bangura mysteriously disappeared from his diplomatic post in the United States and joined Siaka Stevens in Guinea. Faced with the task of consolidating military rule at home, Juxon-Smith could not afford to antagonize the neighboring states of Liberia and Guinea, both of whose leaders did not welcome the coup, fearing that it might have an unsettling effect on their armies. In March 1968, Juxon-Smith heard of plans by APC supporters to invade Sierra Leone from Guinea. Siaka Stevens and Colonel John Amadou Bangura had been training the APC supporters in Guinea in a bid to oust Juxon-Smith and his military regime, which many believed would not give up power voluntarily. Therefore, a guerrilla movement of young Sierra Leoneans was organized in the neighboring Republic of Guinea by the APC. The thousands of recruits who slipped through the border were trained in self-defense tactics and the use of weapons, with the connivance of the Guinean authorities who detested the spread of the coup virus in West Africa. As rumors of the activities of these APC militants spread in Sierra Leone, Juxon-Smith and the NRC grew apprehensive. Juxon-Smith therefore paid a visit to Sékou Touré of Guinea to persuade him to withdraw support from the APC. The trip, according to one commentator, was a total diplomatic disaster. At the invitation of Juxon-Smith, the president of Liberia, William Tubman, made a stopover in Freetown during a journey from London in 1967. All in all, the foreign policy of the regime has been described as uninspiring, largely because the NRC was led by apolitical men, people who did not have a political strategy or revolutionary ideology. In addition, Juxon-Smith was a conservative who had hurriedly been recalled from his studies in England to take control of the government. He was therefore ill-prepared for the job. Sooner rather than later, the question of a return to civilian rule would assume top priority with the NRC. Although it had rejected some important findings of the Dove-Edwin Commission, it could not postpone the decision on handing over power to civilians indefinitely. A civilian committee was set up to advise the NRC on the method of and procedure for handing over to a civilian government. It was made up of 75 members, chosen from the proscribed APC and SLPP, the 6 successful independent candidates in the 1967 election, the Advisory Council, paramount chiefs, and organizations such as the Sierra Leone Teachers Union, the Bar Association, Medical Association, and others. The committee was required to ascertain the necessity for fresh elections, the possibility of establishing a national government, and the various stages by which a handover to a constitutional government could be effected. The committee rejected the idea of another general election because of the heavy cost involved at a time of austerity. It recommended that Parliament should be reconvened and it would have to decide on the choice of a Prime Minister. The seemingly close working relationship between the SLPP and the APC delegations soon suffered considerable damage, when the majority of the committee members suggested that politicians guilty of corrupt practices should be banned from entering Parliament for a period of 5 to 10 years. Since the SLPP, as the previous government, stood to suffer adversely from such a proposal, its representatives readily rejected it. It was, however, becoming clear that the nation was increasingly opposed to the continued exercise of power by the military. As rumors of the activities of the APC militants continued to spread in Sierra Leone, the NRC issued stern warnings against subversive elements. As Juxon-Smith had made clear in May 1967, the council did not wish to hand over power to Siaka Stevens as Prime Minister as a result of the last election. If Juxon-Smith and his men could afford to hold civilians at bay, they could not do the same to the rank and file of the army for an indefinite period. During the announcement of the takeover, Major Blake promised that the NRC would not enhance the social status of its members, but such pronouncement was soon discarded when the NRC began to promote its members. Scarcely a month after his assumption of office, Lieutenant Colonel Juxon-Smith became a full colonel, while Major Blake was promoted to Lieutenant Colonel. In July 1967, Juxon-Smith became a brigadier, Lieutenant Colonel Blake became a full colonel, and Major Jumu and Major Kai Samba were both promoted to lieutenant colonels. All these developments occurred at a time when the ordinary soldier found it difficult to make ends meet. When austerity measures were imposed on the country, the army private felt the pinch as much as his civilian counterpart. Plans to improve his lot never materialized. Even a wage demand as low as 20 cents per day was not countenanced. Conditions in the barracks were bad. Toilet facilities were outmoded and deplorable, while new uniforms promised by the NRC when it took office had not appeared a year later. Yet the army's other ranks and ordinary policemen believed that the NRC, the senior army and police officers, were basking in untold wealth, as evidenced, for example, in easy access to loans for the purchase of cars and other amenities. There was a widespread belief that the assets confiscated by, and the money paid to, the commissions of inquiry were being diverted by the leadership. Junior officers who should have sympathized with the other ranks were believed to be in collusion with the NRC clique and the senior officers, especially as they, junior officers, hoped to be appointed to the Secretariat as NRC members with responsibility for internal affairs. In spite of the soldiers' difficulties, there was no end to the top brass desire to carry out strict military regulations. One of these was the notorious administrative inspection, when various units of the army were expected to clean up their quarters and places of work for a general examination. In previous years, funds had been provided to procure the necessary items such as paint, for example. The grinding austerity period of the NRC rule meant that they could not secure the money to cover the cost involved. Yet, military headquarters and especially the battalion adjutant, Lieutenant Samuel Hinga Norman, were determined to carry out the inspection to the letter. While many men managed to procure the requisite items, other soldiers unable to meet the deadline for the inspection had to be confined to the guardroom, while a few others suffered a reduction in rank. Faced with these unbearable conditions, the privates began to think of a mutiny. a 24-year-old radio operator in the army, Morlai Kamara, first mooted the idea of a coup against the NRC. He felt his salary was a little beggarly. On detachment from the Wilberforce barracks in Freetown to the eastern town of Daru in the Kalahun district, he met like-minded spirits who blamed their low wages and unenviable conditions of service on the NRC. Returning to Wilberforce, Morlai Kamara discovered that the resentment against officers was rife. In spite of some indications that all was not well with the Army's junior ranks, the officers chose to ignore these signs of discontent. Once again in Daru, Morlai Kamara and his friends worked out the details of methods by which the seizure of power from the NRC was to be carried out. The plotters at Daru were to get in touch with the group at Wilberforce through radio communication as a signal for the arrest of all officers. The privates enlisted the support of the Warrant Officer Class 1, Patrick Conte, attached to Army Education, and Company Sergeant Major, Imadu Rogers, both of whom eventually assumed leadership of the counter-coup. Some external influence may also have played a part in instigating the mutiny. It is alleged that a prominent APC figure, who was an ex-Army Sergeant Major, paid frequent visits to Wilberforce barracks. Rumor had it that Colonel John Amadou Bangura was in Freetown about a week before the overthrow of the NRC. Whatever the case, the NRC was losing its original cohesion in the face of Juxon-Smith's delays over the question of a return to the barracks. When the Civilian Rule Committee presented its report to Juxon-Smith on March 20, 1968, it was pointed out that military rule should come to an end not later than 3 months from that date. Juxon-Smith seemed unimpressed by the sense of urgency displayed by the Civilian Rule Committee. The report was not brought for discussion until almost a month after its submission. Even then, Juxon-Smith was reported to have been against an early hand over to the civilians, preferring, as did some younger NRC members, the enlargement of the ruling council by appointing civilians to it. The original coup leaders, Blake, Jumu, and Kai Samba, saw little wrong with the committee's recommendation, and they pressed Juxon-Smith to accept the proposals and make way for an early withdrawal. In this, they had the support of Commissioner of Police William Lee, who was also the deputy chairman of the NRC. Juxon-Smith remained obdurate, and after a meeting on April 17, 1968, Blake, Jumu, and Kai Samba decided to put pressure on Juxon-Smith to accept the committee's verdict once and for all. They decided that if Juxon-Smith failed to accede to this, he would be promptly arrested and removed from the scene. The next day's meeting, at which Juxon-Smith was to have been removed, was never held, for the junior ranks of the army had taken matters into their own hands, beginning on the night of April 17, 1968. At Wilberforce, Daru, and in and around Freetown, private soldiers went in search of their officers. Juxon-Smith, who held the keys to the armory, was seized, as were other members of the NRC, except Jumu, who managed to escape to Ghana. Probably the army privates had merely been bent on arresting only military officers, but they were soon joined by police constables who went about looking for their officers, from the rank of Assistant Superintendent of Police upwards. By dawn on April 18, 1968, the systematic arrest of police and army officers seemed to have been complete. All members of the NRC were arrested and detained, except Jumu, who managed to escape to Ghana. Therefore, he was not apprehended. In all, 76 army and 48 police officers were arrested and detained at the Pademba Road prison in Freetown. In a broadcast to the nation on the morning of the takeover, Imadu Rogers, speaking on behalf of the Anti-Corruption Revolutionary Movement (ACRM), pointed out that at the time of the establishment of the NRC, it was not realized that the people they had chosen to direct the nation's affairs were more corrupt and selfish than the ousted civilian regime. Thus ended the NRC. The newly formed ACRM then invited Colonel John Amadou Bangura and Lieutenant Colonel Ambrose Patrick Jenda to return to Sierra Leone to head the ACRM. Colonel John Amadou Bangura, who was already in Guinea, just crossed over to Sierra Leone and took over the leadership of the ACRM. He then dissolved the ACRM and formed an interim administration known as the National Interim Council, NIC. A retired police officer, Malcolm Parker, became his deputy. While the NIC announced its intention to hand over power to the civilian parliamentarians, with Colonel John Amadou Bangura in command, there was no question that only Siaka Stevens would be accepted at the head of the new government. Colonel John Amadou Bangura, then invited Siaka Stevens to return to Sierra Leone and hold the position of Prime Minister. The NIC soon made arrangements for the return to civilian rule. It published the results of the 1967 election, restored the constitution, appointed Sir Banja Tejan, the Chief Justice, as officer performing the function of Governor General, and summoned all successful candidates to a meeting at State House in Freetown on April 26, 1968. At this meeting, Siaka Stevens was appointed Prime Minister and was resworn. As soon as Siaka Stevens assumed the premiership, he soon proceeded to levy charges of conspiracy to overthrow him in 1967 against Brigadier General David Lansana, Lieutenant Samuel Hinga Norman, and other officers of the army, civilians, Commissioner of Police William Lee, and former close associates of Albert Margai. Soon after, charges of treason were preferred against Juxon-Smith and his NRC colleagues, with the exception of Alpha Kamara, the Deputy Commissioner of Police. Juxon-Smith was tried and sentenced to death. However, he won his appeal in September 1971, but even though he had won his appeal against the death sentence in 1971, Siaka Stevens continued to detain him until July 1973, when he regained his freedom. After his release, his family was harassed by authorities as armed men turned up regularly at their house. Even though he had distanced himself from politics and the military, life after the coup became increasingly tough. Eventually, it became too dangerous for him and his family to stay in the country, and he smuggled himself together with his family out of the country, telling no one, leaving everything behind and resettling in the United States. On September 15, 1996, Juxon-Smith passed away in New York, having never returned to Sierra Leone.